This is Duke University.
Hi everybody, I'm Dave Munden, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Duke University Libraries. We're your campus information utility that connects people and ideas. Today I'd like to thank the campus, East Campus Residence Life, and also the Sanford School of Public Policy for helping sponsor this event. When I first wrote Professor Feaver and asked him if he'd be willing to speak around some of the election events, he said that he was tied up, but he'd be willing to come the day after to perform a post-mortem. But I don't know, after last night it seems like our democracy is kind of alive and kicking. And so I'm very interested to see what they're going to say. We're also honored to have Bruce Jentleson from the Sanford School as well. Also, they agreed to kind of do it Feaver style, just as Howard Dean and Karl Rove introduced each other. Our guests are going to introduce each other, and, you know, I didn't flip a coin, but I think they'll decide which will go first. But let's give them a warm welcome.
So I did offer to do a post-mortem. I didn't realize just how dead the patient would be that I would be having to talk about. But it is good to be. This is my last campaign-related event with Bruce Jentleson, which I've in 2012 anyway. We've done a whole number of these, and it seems like we every 4 years we get the chance to go at it hammer and tongs. And I enjoy it because Bruce is one of the more thoughtful and influential foreign policy specialists on the Democratic side of the aisle. So he's a professor of public policy and political science, and he's been at Duke for about a decade now or longer.
12 years.
Yeah, 12 years. And he came to head up the Sanford Public Policy Department at the time and prepare it for the transition to school. But he's also a prolific scholar who's published in the areas of the politics of American foreign policy, particularly how public opinion shapes America's role abroad, and also especially American foreign policy in the Middle East. He's also a prolific commentator for the general audience. So he was one of the early bloggers back when the interweb was still a new thing, and of course his commentary appears in newspapers, on TV, radio, etc. But then of a special importance and something I value very highly, Bruce is a serious player in the foreign policy making community. He's had several stints working in government, most recently a senior advisor to the policy planning director at the State Department, which is the shop at the State Department where the big think strategy of American foreign policy is done. And Bruce is one of the more valued members. I think that there's expectation that he may get phone calls in the next administration. I won't be presumptuous as to what that would be, but certainly his contribution is valued and is respected on the other side of the aisle. He has a huge blind spot on Romney's foreign policy, which will probably come out. But other than that, he's a remarkable contributor to the debate. But I think the accomplishment of which he's most proud, and so I'll leave it with this, is that this fall, he achieved a very important distinction, and that is the title of Grandpa. And so I'm not sure if that made him more happy than last night or not. We can perhaps, that'll be our first question for him.
That's good, thank you. Well, thank you, Peter. Actually, on that, our grandson who lives in Washington, D.C., we got, first his father took him to vote in the stroller.
See, I knew it, voter fraud.
That's
this
right.
is exactly what I expected.
It gets worse. And then later his mother took him to vote. So he did vote twice, and they changed his little hat the second time so he wouldn't be recognized. So Peter and I have done a lot. We've written, we did op-eds in the, and I know some of you may have seen the day after the foreign policy debate, we fenced a bit on foreignpolicy.com, which is the leading foreign policy website. And I think we like to sort of say that we try to do it, you know, in a way that perhaps more should do it, which is more light than heat. You know, we can disagree and only get disagreeable a little bit, usually in fun, and be friends and colleagues and work together a lot on a variety of things. We both are professors here. Peter, his principal appointment's in political science, and he comes over to Stanford, and I do vice versa. Has written an awful lot, really, on a number of foreign policy issues, particularly civil-military relations, going way back to his own work early in his career and all the way through, and you know, some very important issues there about relations in a country who constitutionally has civilian control of the military, about civil-military relations. We shared a grant a few years ago from a foundation and worked together on that. He served in the second term of the George W. Bush administration, and in a similar capacity, there was a strategic planning shop within the White House, which he actually helped, as they say in Washington, stand up and get started, and is a very important part of the foreign policy apparatus. Has continued in the Obama administration, and it's an effort to sort of do some thinking beyond the immediate inbox, you know, in the context of government. It's not like being an academic and looking 20 years out, but it's a really important role to play. So we have a good time, and so I think I actually should tell one funny story. We did these op-eds in the N&O, and he got a very nasty email from a person who was calling him all sorts of names, and I guess he had an exchange with this person going back and forth, and then kind of brought me into it, and the person was accusing him not only being wrong on foreign policy, which of course he was, but of just being not a good person. And so there was something, I can tell the story about the person.
Well, he said, yeah, he said that he had a standing cash offer, that it was impossible to hold the views that I held without being stupid, ignorant, greedy, or mean. And I said, you know, well, is there any way I can get this cash award? What do I have to do to get this cash award? And he said, well, you need to find, you know, evidence. He'll accept email evidence that you're not those things. So I CC'd Bruce on one of these. I said, Bruce, you know, this is our chance. Can you, and Bruce wrote this gracious note saying about how wrong I was on everything, but I wasn't those bad things. And so I got a $100 cash donation to the charity of my choice. I was really thinking of picking a odious charity for this guy, but I picked one that was politically neutral, and it was a fun little event.
It was fun, yes. So we thought we would start, maybe each give a little bit of analysis of the results of the election. We're both foreign policy guys, and so we're more in a position to talk about those issues going forward, but you know, as pundits, you talk about anything, you know, that you think, you know, and then really open up to questions and discussion. This is, I'm sure people have a lot of things that are on their minds, but, you know, I would say, just to sort of lay out, I think, 5 factors, and we can come back to these, I don't want to spend a lot of time on each one, but just sort of put them out there on the table that I think help explain the election results last night. And one, I think, is, and I think Peter would probably agree with some of this, is the self-inflicted wounds the Republican Party did to itself. Not only at the presidential level, but if you look at the results of the Senate races in Indiana, where a Tea Party candidate in the primary beat a very distinguished Republican senator, Richard Lugar, for many years chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and beat him in the primary, Lugar would have won that seat going away. The Democratic Party would have given like zero money to their candidate. The Democrat, congressman from the area, Joe Donnelly, beat Richard Murdoch, I think his name was. Also someone who, I guess, fairly recently made a statement, I may not get it totally right, but you get the gist, that something along the lines that if a woman was raped and she had the baby, it would be something like God's will. And so Indiana, which rarely goes Democrat, it did go Democrat for President Obama in 2008, did not this time, elected Joe Donnelly. In Missouri, the incumbent Democratic Senator Claire McCaskill was also being seen as likely to lose and ran against a Republican Congressman Aiken, who made similar statements about women, abortion, rape, and the like, and won by a very large margin. So there's some very, and I think it's fair to say that both of those seats, anybody on the Democratic side of the Senate would have told you the Republicans had them. Could have made a really big difference in the majority. As it is, I think there's a couple of contested seats. Democrats may actually come out going from 53 to 55, depending upon North Dakota and Montana, that are, I just checked the website, and the before I came here, the Democrat was a little bit ahead, but those are contests. And I think, Governor Romney going through the primary process had a lot of the experience Democrats had in the 1970s, where you have to tack to the extreme of your party, and you take positions. And they become self-inflicted as you try to run. So I think one factor was that. I think a second factor was strategy. You had people on TV tonight saying that the David Axelrod and David Plouffe, the Obama team, were the greatest political strategists in history. That's a little much, right, to say, in the moment. But they had a very effective strategy, and I think it's an important lesson for anybody, whether you're in politics or business. They really put a lot of thought, a lot of data, a lot of analysis into their strategy, and they stuck with it. They did not change their strategy with every political win. I think they had a little hurricane that hit them, not Sandy, but the first debate, which they didn't anticipate, and they made some shifts there. But in the end, their use of analysis and targeting, we've known presidential candidates, no names mentioned, and some on my side of the aisle, who changed strategy, weekly practically. These guys had a strategy. I think it's very important for anybody doing anything. If you put a lot of thought into your strategy, you don't see it through blindly, but it gives you a better chance. And I think their capacity to target the groups, to really turn out the vote, was a second critical factor. A third one I would stress is policy. And we'll come back to this. I really think that, the debate on the domestic side about the appropriate role of government in society and the economy, I actually think was taken to more of extreme by the Republican side. And Hurricane Sandy, in its own way, I think reminded people implicitly the government has an important role to play in people's lives. But I think it's broader than that. And I think as we talk more about going forward, I think if you look at the successful countries and economies around the world, there are countries in which the state does not control the whole economy, but they find a middle ground between the role of the state and the economy. And I think that in policy, there was, I think, a general sense that where Obama was more in tune with more Americans. Foreign policy, too, we'll talk more about that. I think that was true as well in foreign policy. Last two factors. One is President himself. I think clearly people, there's hardly anybody going around saying that he was totally successful in his first term. And there were many areas, I think, in which various groups, including groups on the left, were disappointed. His performance in the first debate, was, really hurt him a lot. But at the end of the day, I really believe that many voters, not just Democrats, believe that President Barack Obama was the leader that we needed at this point in time. There was some evidence the economy is starting to turn. That all of the qualities of leadership, not just their policy positions, but his judgment, the ways he makes decisions, I think that was really part of it. People at the end of the day really voted for him, and there are a number of polling indicators about who you prefer in different things, on that. And last, I would say, is the country is changing. I would describe this as sort of our first 21st century election. And if you look at what's happening out there, in the Senate, we elected, Hawaii elected the first Asian American woman senator in the history of the United States. Wisconsin elected the first acknowledged lesbian, gay woman senator to the Senate. Same-sex marriage proposals lost in some states, but actually won in some. I think it was Maryland and Maine, if I'm not mistaken. Legalization of marijuana won in Colorado and Washington. I'm not saying it's going to happen everywhere. Hispanics were a much larger voting segment of the population. We're really becoming a 21st century country in terms of our diversity defined in a lot of different ways, socially, ethnically, racially. And I think that was a big factor. And it happened that the Democrats and President Obama had a greater appeal to a wider number of constituencies as we try to figure out what it means to be a 21st century country. And I think all of those things together, anyway, help sort of, for me at least, explain kind of why things happened the way they did.
So I agree with much of that analysis, not all of it, but much of it. This was not a wave election. This was a pretty close one, and the popular vote was closer than the Electoral College spread would indicate. And so I think it was an election that was won. You said strategy. I think as much strategy and tactics. In 2008, President Obama presented a compelling vision that won over a lot of people who were otherwise doubtful about him, but thought that he were attracted to the big vision that he presented. That was not how he ran in 2012. And in 2012, it was very much a micro-targeting tactical game. And what's interesting is that both sides got to largely pursue their tactical game. I think the Republicans were more hamstrung by money than they expected, but I don't think that, I think they otherwise pursued pretty much the game that they thought that they were going to pursue, or the game plan, I should say. And their estimate of what the composition of the electorate would be was wrong, and the Obama team's estimate of what the composition of the electorate would be was right, and that was the difference. When it's that close, though, then it creates an opportunity for a lot of second guessing, right? When a team loses by 17 touchdowns, then it doesn't, the one interception doesn't matter, or the one fumble doesn't matter. But when it's as close as this one was, it's possible to revisit some of the hiccups, and you mentioned some of them. The Republican convention was something of a bust, interrupted by a different hurricane. They had to adjust it on the fly, and in the process of readjusting it on the fly, some important things got left out, and so the message coming out of the convention was, you forgot to mention the troops, which of course was not what the Republicans wanted coming out of their convention. And so a lost opportunity for momentum there. There's no question that Hurricane Sandy hurt the administration. I mean, sorry, hurt the Romney campaign. I'm not sure that it was his politic to go as far as Chris Matthews went, where he said he was thankful for Hurricane Sandy. Not the finest moment in punditry last night, but nevertheless, it's true that Hurricane Sandy robbed Romney of an opportunity to capitalize on momentum, and he sort of disappeared from the public narrative for a while. It also reminded the public of the role of government in crisis. I think your analysis of that is right. But the other thing it did was it allowed President Obama to dominate visually the field without being partisan, which was hard for him, which is normally hard to do the last week of a campaign. If you're in there, you're partisan. But he was able to do it. And you had this odd thing of one of his most effective critics. I think up until the last week, I would have said Chris Christie is the guy who can really, tear off a coat of paint off of an opponent, and he had been quite effective at that. But he pivots and is having a bromance with the president, and so that all these little things may have shifted on the margins. And if you shift enough of these on the margins, do you shift the electoral vote? Maybe you do. Some bigger things, the Republican Party has to develop a message on immigration that's different from the message that they carried this election. You just cannot go forward appearing to be the anti-immigration party. Now, I think the appeal to Latino voters is broader than just the immigration issue. So I'm not pretending that that's the whole story, but that's important. President Bush cut into Democratic margins with Latino voters, and President Bush had a very different message on immigration reform. So, and that challenge is going to be greater 4 years from now than it is today, going to be greater 8 years from now than it is 4 years from now, and so on. So there's some bigger issues like that the Republicans have to deal with. But here's an interesting one. I came today prepared to say, well, foreign policy didn't matter in the election outcome. But then I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and I may be wrong. What I'm about to say may be wrong, and my prior may still be right that it didn't matter in the margins. But if my back-of-the-envelope calculations are right, according to the exit polls that I saw, and of course they're somewhat squirrely. We don't know how much they're capturing early voters, so that this may be wrong, but about 5, according to the Washington Post's reporting on the exit polls, 5% of the electorate said their number one issue was foreign policy. And of that group, Obama won 56%. So if you take 56% of 5% of the electorate, you get 3.3 million voters, which is more than the margin between the two of them. And so it'd be interesting if it was the case that foreign policy and particularly President Obama's decent record in foreign policy, and I would say Romney's inability to critique it as effectively as could have been critiqued, that may have moved a small percentage of the electorate, which may have mattered in a small way, and in a tight election like this, small differences might matter. So that'd be my analysis.
Yeah, on that point, I think it's interesting because we all have a stake in foreign policy mattering, and I was serving over the course of the campaign on the Obama campaign's Foreign Policy National Security Advisory Steering Committee, and so we did a lot of...
I should be clear, I didn't say anything you did mattered in the...
No, that's right. I'm just going to be analytic about the area we work in, that we share mattering, that's right. I thought it was that one article I wrote, and Romney's failure to read yours, and then he would have been much more effective.
That's probably it, yeah.
But I think, we did a lot of surrogacy, and I think when you measure the effect of foreign policy, I think it's interesting that 5% cited. This was not an election that had a particular salient issue, like Iraq was in 2006 in the congressional election, or it really was in the Democratic primary in 2008, or the Korean War was back in 1952 with Eisenhower and Truman. It was more thematic. And so the real questions were, I think, people wouldn't articulate it in these terms, but conceptually it was, whose view of, kind of what the threats and opportunities in the world are did you agree more with? Whose conception of how you use American power did you agree with? And I think that there's also sort of a bank shot strategy. When people say in these polls that they voted on the basis of leadership, if you dig down and you ask the follow-up question, a lot of times they use foreign policy to measure that. So I think we share that sense that it really was, nobody ever said, it was going to be as important as the economy. But, I was giving a talk on this overseas back in May, and they said, well, you guys are wasting your time. I said, look, if it's a close election, it's like the marginal difference could well come. And I think that's, that's Peter's point. So it's not that it was the decisive issue, but the notion that it was only about the economy, voting's too complex for that. And so I think it did play in. Americans have an understanding, and this Benghazi issue got a lot of attention, but it was really kind of a surrogate for other things. Americans understand that this is a complicated world. That we can't cut ourselves off from it. Isolationism, it's not a good or a bad policy. It's simply not an option. And so they continue to pay attention to this. And Obama was the first Democratic candidate for president in a very long time to poll better pretty consistently on commander-in-chief, who do you trust in a crisis. And that was a flip. Democrats had been used to being seen, I think unfairly, as soft and all that sort of thing, and it got flipped in this situation. And so, it was a contributing factor there. You want to kick off maybe on what you think on the agenda coming forward?
The flip side of my argument that foreign policy may have mattered on the margins, may have tipped the scales, is that I think it's unusual the extent to which we're coming out of this election without many clear answers from the American people on the foreign policy challenges that will most preoccupy President Obama in his second term. I think there's a general mood out of the public that is war weariness. So there's that vague guidance that comes from the electorate to the president. But what that should mean for the kind of policy that the administration needs to decide on, I think is pretty vague from the election. And so, in that sense, President Obama is free to do whatever he feels is best. He's not going to be bucking up against a strong electoral message one way, but it also means he doesn't have much of an electoral momentum, I think, behind him that will build political support for these tough decisions. And let me just tick off a bunch that are going to come due. Probably some of these will come due during the transition phase, even before the second inaugural. So Here's one. Do we seek a UN Security Council resolution on Syria, a Chapter 7 thing? And if we can't get Russia and China to go along with it, do we do a Kosovo where we act on Syria, intervene in Syria without a UN resolution? And if so, do we lead from behind or lead from the front? How do we do that?
You mean lead for results or for not results?
Exactly, whatever, however you want to say it. But it's remarkable. I think that decision, I wouldn't be surprised if the White House foreign policy staff were working that issue on election day to a certain extent. I mean, that is a very pressing issue. And the campaign was silent, really, on it. And if you say, no, we're not going to intervene, we're going to take our cue that we're war weary, how are you going to mitigate the spiral of sectarian violence in the Middle East? This is Bruce's area of expertise, so he may have the answer. But if he has the answer, that answer didn't get it discussed much in the campaign. What role should the U.S. take in the likely intervention in Mali? This is a less daunting military mission than doing something in Syria, but it's a problem. And I'm pretty sure that the American public is not really ready for whatever the options might be there. What do we do what is America's responsibility if the Eurozone crisis peaks again? And what can the U.S. do beyond what we've already done? How can we help China manage their own leadership transition? As nasty as the debate the campaign up until last night around 11:30 was, there was something of a kumbaya between the two campaigns when Romney graciously conceded. And I think other countries look at the capacity to hand power, a sort of bitter campaign and then a peaceful transition. That's a pretty remarkable political achievement. And China, I think, is struggling with that. And the Chinese transition, it's not going to be violent, but the instability and the likelihood for hyper-nationalism or adventurism, particularly regarding the island dispute with Japan and the South China Seas, that's going to be a challenge for the administration. And there's a bunch more. These are just the ones that will come due in the near term. What about the ones that are longer term? How will we manage the war on terror, however you want to call it, when we're increasingly relying on a tactic that the world increasingly abhors, which is drone strikes? That's becoming more and more the centerpiece of the Obama administration's approach to the combating terrorist networks. But the world's patience for that tactic, I think, is waning. And how will the administration chart its way through there? What will the administration do about climate change, given that it was unable to accomplish in 2009 when it had stronger Senate majority and controlled the House of Representatives? What's it going to be able to do this time around? I think they've exhausted the executive branch only side of policy. They're going to have to work with Congress. They're going to have to work with a world that is much less willing to sacrifice on behalf of that issue now than they were 4 years ago. And there's many more of these kinds of challenges that the next administration will have to deal with. The good news is that President Obama is now running for re-election. And he's already a lame duck, but lame duck presidents run for their legacy. And they are willing and capable of doing politically painful things that might be in the country's interest to salvage dangerous situations. Bush administration did that with the Iraq surge, which I think changed the trajectory of the Iraq from one very negative trajectory to something that was more hopeful. The Obama administration may be able to do similar statesman-like things in international relations. And the other good news is that they have a deep bench of experts and good people to draw on. So it's not the case that there were only 5 staffers who knew how to run things, and they're all exhausted, they're going, and now it's going to be a dangerous inmates running the asylum second term. I hope, at least, that they will make wise choices, and that will contribute to some wise policies on these issues that I've outlined. And pass it off to you.
Sure. Let me make a couple comments, and maybe we'll open it up for questions if anything people want to talk about. I mean, I do agree. I think second terms of presidencies allow them to think about their legacy, not just in an egotistical history book kind of way, but one of the things I really genuinely believe are really important that I might have been more constrained of doing politically when I, was in my first term. And a lot of that does take precedence into foreign policy. And I think that there is an opportunity here for President Obama to help the country adjust and adapt to a 21st century world, which is very different than the Cold War or even the immediate post-Cold War world was. As an example of that is this whole way, during the Libya 2011 military intervention operation, a reporter for the New Yorker magazine did this long story on the decision-making, and like the second or third to the last paragraph of a very long New Yorker story, he had this quote from some staffer saying, well, our strategy there was to lead from behind. Even like the reporter didn't think that was a really juicy quote because he would have had it at the beginning. Well, it took off, it got legs, and it was, Romney's favorite expression. And I will admit that it was probably, a political kryptonite. I mean, it really was not a smart thing to say. But the concept that was trying to get at, particularly in a country that has had a decade, worth of war, when Colin Powell endorsed President Obama this time, in addition to domestic, he said, he got us out of one war, he's getting us out of another, and he hasn't gotten us in a new one. He said all three. And I think that the country feels that, yet at the same time we face some threats and some situations which may require, the use of military force. And what Libya tried to do was to create a situation in which, it wasn't all on us, in terms of the operational burden or the budgetary burden, but we played a really crucial role. And, I have sort of called it leading for results. And I think that's actually, it's not a model that you apply to everything, but I think that's what we really need to see, whether it's Syria or Mali or elsewhere, is coalitions in which the United States plays a role that only we can play. But it's not just we're the big senior partner doing everything and everybody else is kind of carrying our luggage kind of thing. I do agree with Peter on Syria. I think that it's not just the election, but the situation has changed dramatically in the last month. It really has threatening to become much more of a regional conflict. I was at a meeting with some Turks a week ago and some Israelis trying to work on their relationship, and we met over in Europe. And, this is threatening to become a regional conflict. Turkey is a NATO ally. It's had an effect on Lebanon. And I think the combination of the end of the election and that will lead us to some sort of, a more robust shift, under this coalition called the Friends of Syria, which will have to include some Arab countries as well as some Western countries. How military it gets, I don't know, but I think it'll be more robust. I think it's not just the election, but it's the transformation. I think we will see some things on that. I agree with that on the transition. I mean, a lot of the other issues, I think the whole issues in Asia are not just about China. If there's been bipartisanship in the 2010, 2012 congressional elections, it's both parties doing China bashing. I mean, you look at the commercials. It's much more complicated. The conflict between China and Japan has a lot of historical resonance for them. Japan and South Korea even have some tension over certain islands that go back to history. We have to figure out a role to play that helps balance without overplaying our hand and becoming a factor that contributes to instability. But I think Asia is in a transition period, including, as Peter said, this whole transition within China's leadership. Just one other point, we could talk about more of the questions, is the climate change thing. The definition of leadership is building political support even when you don't think it's there. And I think, truth in advertising, I spent many years working for a guy named Al Gore, who's been talking about this for a long, long time. And I wasn't an environmental specialist, but I learned a lot about this issue. To me, common sense and a lot of science tells us, that climate change has been happening. I mean, it's just everywhere, all the evidence, whether it's the melting of the glaciers, or a whole variety of things, or it may well be the new branding is going to be extreme weather, right? That may sell better for communicators. But I have to say that one of the spots in the campaign on the Republican side that disturbed me the most was at a Romney rally. he was talking about something else. And a heckler stood up and said, well, what about climate change? And it wasn't how Governor Romney responded, but the crowd started chanting to drown him out, USA, USA, USA. And it was almost as if to be for climate change was to somehow acknowledge we're not number one in the world, that it's un-American. And I think that does speak to some of the underlying politics that is very disturbing. But it's a form of denialism that, like in your personal life, if you have a problem, you don't deal with it, it gets worse. And I think that issue has to get attention. President Obama mentioned it last night. He didn't mention many issues, but in what was intended to be much more of a poetry speech last night, which, you know, I mean, I'm biased, but even at 2:30 in the morning, I was pretty moved by it. He did mention climate change. And I think we're going to have to do something on that. We and the world are going to have to do something on it, because the longer you wait, the fewer options you have, and the more expensive and the less likely they are to be effective. It will mean strategizing the politics. You want to get out there and do it and have it totally, you know, blow up in your face. But I think this is a real challenge for leadership about how you can help people understand why this is important, how you do it in a way that, you know, and again, a lot of evidence, including our own Nicholas School, is constantly producing studies that show that to be green is not to be anti-economy, you know, that you can get win-wins out of that. So anyway, that's an issue that I'd emphasize. But do you maybe want to open it up and see if people have questions or comments about what we've said or anything else? So the floor is open. Tom, yeah.
Good questions for Peter and for both of you. On foreign policy, one of the things that disturbed me about Romney the most, it seemed really extraordinary and improper, was when father off to Israel with his casino magnate in tow, and sort of started saying ridiculous things. And I understand the domestic politics of it. There was something in the paper this morning interviewing some nurse in Georgia, and saying that she was a foreign policy voter. The number one thing was that Romney, she thought she was going to defend Israel, and she was, her church told her that if, we didn't defend Israel as a whole, that this was going to be a huge issue. I have to say that was something I found really disturbing. Maybe along with probably off the end, not exactly showing his diplomacy, talking about the Olympics over there. So my question to you is, what the hell was Romney thinking, and what's your take on that? I'll throw away the other question to you, we can do this later, but one to both of you, if Hillary Clinton is as tired as she looks and has to be around too much longer, who would you bet to take the place?
You want the campaign to start already? 2016? Holy cow, you're still hungover from last night, and you can't.
I think he meant as Secretary of State. He said take her place.
To take her place. Oh, I thought you meant 2016 and already the campaign. Okay. Oh, that's not so bad. So do you? I'll answer the first one and give you my answer to the second, but I'm more interested in hearing Bruce's answer than mine. I think Romney got a bum rap on the trip. It was a missed opportunity, I agree, but what were painted as gaffes were not quite the gaffes that they, some people said, boy, if he says that, then that makes he unfit to be commander-in-chief. As some of the official spokespeople from the Obama campaign said that. That's just absurd. So what he said on the Olympics was, not while he was in London, by the way, but he did a pre-trip interview here in the States, and someone asked him and said, you did the Olympics, and you know how difficult that is, and there have been all these reports in the British press about how much trouble they have and their inadequate security and problems with transportation. Do you think they're going to be ready? And he, instead of giving what is the banal politician's answer, diplomatic answer, says, I have great confidence in our friends, the Brits. He just said, well, that's an important question based on what we're hearing. And he answered it the way a former manager of an Olympics does, thinking, yeah, those are serious problems. If you have that the week before, you've got serious things to handle. I thought, if I was thinking as a staffer, I would have wished he hadn't said it and said the more banal thing, but it was hardly a direct insult to our allies, and it was a little bit rich to have the Obama campaign, which had been guilty of the same kinds of petty insults to, or even I would say more egregious petty insults to the British the first year. Obama was rude to Gordon Brown, gave a very tacky present to the Queen, and these kinds of brouhahas, gave away the second Winston Churchill bust that they had given them. And just tacky things the first year. It was a little rich for the Obama administration to be making big hay out of the one quote on London. On Israel, the person that he took is a casino magnate, but he's also a stout friend of Israel and funds many pro-Israel activities in Israel and in the United States. I mean, he's passionate about the issue of Israel. So he was taking on the trip people that were active in the campaign who cared a lot about Israel, and then when you go to Poland, he takes people who care a lot about Poland, et cetera. That's, I think it got more negative optics because of that particular person is controversial. And in a Saul Alinsky style, the Democrats had tried to sort of make Sheldon Adelson the sort of a demonic figure, and that boosted his status. But there were folks supporters who care about the countries that they visit when they visit them. So I'm not sure that was as bad as you're making it sound. He made another comment there. That's where I thought you were going to go, regarding cultural sources of that hold back development, et cetera. And that was, in some ways created more controversy, I think. The whole trip, I think, was a missed opportunity. It was designed to show that, it's designed to visit the countries that had been close allies to the United States that had received a little bit of rough treatment from the Obama administration. All three of those, Britain, Israel, and Poland, the Obama administration had fumbled the relationship in British case, small ways, Poland case, serious ways, and Israel, pretty serious ways. They recovered, as Bruce will say if he gets a chance when my filibuster's done, on Israel. But nevertheless, it was a way of dramatizing a point that the Romney campaign was making, which is that Obama has an uneven record of standing with our allies. That message was what the trip was supposed to send. No one got that message because of missteps. And so it was a missed opportunity. Didn't make him unfit to be commander-in-chief, but it certainly was a missed opportunity from a staffing point of view. Now, as to your question, yeah.
I'll take care of the response to that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Let him.
I'll respond.
Let him whack away.
Yeah.
I think that it was a two-person race to succeed Secretary Clinton. She had made it clear long ago that she was done. So she was finishing her term as secretary, and while she, flirted with or gave a vague denial or something last week, I think that was just so that she was trying not to appear in a news story. She's leaving. And there's a two-person race to succeed her, I think. It was Susan Rice and Senator Kerry. A distant third might have been Tom Donilon, but I think Tom Donilin's chances of getting promoted to be Secretary of State were wrecked with the leak investigation, which is a legal problem hanging over the administration. And I don't think there's any way that he could be nominated until that one comes to a closure. I don't think that's going to come to closure in time for the transition. So it was a two-person race. Susan Rice, who's currently the ambassador to the UN, and Senator Kerry. And I think Kerry's stock improved dramatically in the last month and a half. First, with the Susan Rice's she delivered the talking points she was supposed to deliver on Benghazi the week after Benghazi, but it turns out those talking points were misleading. She would say it's not her fault, but that would make her very difficult to get confirmed by the Senate. But more, just as consequentially, the Republicans lost seats in the Senate instead of gaining it. So instead of razor-thin majority, the Democrats have senators to spare. So the principal argument against appointing Kerry was you didn't want to lose that Democratic Senate seat because the front runner for it is likely Brown, yeah, who lost last night, but he would be the leading candidate to replace Kerry if Kerry moved over to be Secretary of State. They've got seats to burn now. So I'd be surprised if it's not Kerry, but someone who knows better than me, I want to hear what he says.
So just to go back to the trip, I mean, we, on the campaign's Foreign Policy Steering Committee, we were talking a lot about the Romney trip and getting ready for, in a variety of ways. The trip to Britain was sort of the gift that kept on giving. I mean, it was like, we were all just going to go to the beach and let it happen. And it's important to point out that the two major critics of Romney there were two leading conservative politicians in Britain, Prime Minister Cameron and Mayor Boris Johnson of London. So it wasn't like the Labour Party. But the Israel thing is more consequential because it wasn't just, the Jentleson issue to me was not just that he went on the trip, and something we can talk more about, was the whole role of money in politics. I mean, at the end of the day, Barbara and I were at a party last night, and one of the great statements was somebody said, democracy is alive and well in America, and money can't buy it. It's enormous amounts of money, and I know both sides did it. I worry a lot about this whole Citizens United decision and the amounts of money being thrown into campaigns. And Jentleson, including his support for Gingrich, was way, way up there. The Koch brothers, and I don't want to sort of demonize and get into conspiracy theory, but it's a real issue for our democracy. And so I think that's what made that. But the bigger issue, I think, was two things. One was he loved to use the line, Governor Romney, that we threw Israel under the bus. This administration has given more military assistance, intelligence cooperation, and other support to Israel than any previous administration. The Israeli defense minister has said so. The Israeli president has said so. The Israeli prime minister and the president of the United States happen to not get along very well. In fact, a lot of Israel does not get along with the Israeli prime minister. And he happened to be an old friend and colleague of Governor Romney. And I think he's put himself in a little bit of a fix by Israelis were telling me how much he overplayed his hand. To say that we, have not been, 100% supportive of any notion that Israel might attack Iran militarily at this point, is not to throw Israel under the bus. Might actually be the best thing for Israel. As in fact, that's what, some Israeli leaders have been saying. But it's a difference of policy. We've had some differences over the Palestinian issue. But we've been extremely supportive on fundamental security things. And so that critique was responded to. Both before the trip, during the trip, and after the trip, constantly. And I think that, the other piece of that was the whole Palestinian thing. It wasn't just the trip, but the famous 47% video, had a basic comment saying the Israelis want peace and the Palestinians don't. Well, that's patently false. It's not that many Israelis do want peace. They really do. But many Palestinians do too. So I think there are a lot of things rolled up in the Middle East issue that went beyond on the Jentleson thing. And Poland, polling in Poland, which I can't say 3 times fast, showed that President Obama had continued to have a net positive view among the Polish people. So this notion that we were more than happy to take on this notion that we weren't good to our traditional allies. That was fine as a substantive debate. On the Secretary of State question,
everything you said on Israel is dated 2010 and afterwards. What he's not talking about was the controversial policies of the spring of 2009. That was the substance of the throwing under the bus. It's not the Iran issue. It was the escalating of the stakes on what were the preconditions for in terms of settlement policy in Jerusalem. That was I don't agree with that at all in terms of that throwing Israel under the bus, but we can kind of pick that up if somebody wants to. On the Secretary of State question, there's the old Washington adage, those who say don't know and those who know don't say, and I don't think anybody really knows except the President. Peter's right. No Secretary of State has served more than 4 years in recent history other than George Shultz, who came in 1982 and served for 6 years in the Reagan administration. So it's very normal
for a Secretary of State, not to mention one that maintained the incredible travel schedule that Hillary Clinton did to leave. And she's been clear all year on that. A lot of cabinet officials, I think, will leave after 4 years. I think, wasn't Norman Mineta the only Bush administration official, Secretary of Transportation, to stay for 8 years? You know, I mean, what Peter said about Ambassador Rice and Senator Kerry is pretty much what people are saying around Washington. Kerry did increase his stock, including at the convention. I was at the convention, and he'd waited 8 years to finally get to say this line about Mitt Romney switching positions on things. He said, you know, he was for it before he was against it. And the smile on the guy's face was like, you know, you could see it on the big screen up at the top. He gave a good speech at the convention. It wasn't, you know, Kerry sometimes can be, you know, go on and on. It was a good convention speech. And he did play this role, you know, in the debates. And some people wondered after the first debate, was Kerry going to get the blame for Obama's poor performance? And he didn't. He continued to play the role in the second debate. So his stock has gone up. My own sense is that the president could not choose another Washington insider other than Ambassador Rice, who's very close to Obama and worked for him in his first presidential run, other than Kerry. You know, he couldn't go to another senator. I think that Kerry, you know, he couldn't do that. So I think Kerry is the only, Kerry and Ambassador Rice. I agree with Peter on National Security Advisor Donnellan. There could be sort of a proverbial outside-the-box person that none of us have thought of that comes from, you know, the business world or the foundation world or something that could emerge, that if that happened, you could make an argument to Kerry that I wanted a very different kind of secretary. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that's the only other possibility I see there. So. Other questions? Yeah. I don't know that, I think, I mean, the court made a decision, seems to me, neither of us are lawyers, that the Congress would have to pass some kind of additional legislation on top of the old so-called McCain-Feingold Act that stayed within the parameters that the Supreme Court has set, or over time find another case to bring to the court, and maybe it would rule differently if the composition of the court changes. I don't think it's something the president can do. People will now study, including many of our colleagues, political scientists who do American politics, what the impact was. I had students in my class the other day, we were talking about this, you know, last week of the campaign, really wondering, how much impact does it have? You know, there was that YouTube little commercial about this little girl, right, crying and saying, no more Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, you know. And you really wonder, you know, is there a tipping point or a point of diminishing return from it? I have no idea. But I do feel that it's not good for democracy. Many other democracies manage to run campaigns getting higher rates of voter participation, a variety of other things, without the, you know, enormous sums of money that we're kicking in. And the Obama administration spent plenty of money, the union spent plenty of money, but I just think that, you know, and again, I may be wrong about this, but the amount of reporting that these, you know, private groups have to do is a lot less than the others, and so you don't really know who's spending what. And I think that's just not healthy for American democracy.
The way it's usually reported, it's reported as if the money advantage is with the Republicans. That wasn't the case. The Democrats matched the Republicans in this election. And more importantly, I would say that the Democrats had the money advantage, by which I mean that they had the money free to spend during the summer at a time when Romney did not. And that was one of the few tactical constraints that prevented the Romney campaign from doing what they might otherwise have done. Now, it's true that the super PAC stepped in and to a certain extent tried to level the playing field, but the Romney campaign themselves, they weren't allowed to coordinate with them, and they weren't able to respond as effectively. So President Obama spent hundreds of millions of dollars in attack ads during the summer, some of the most expensive negative advertising in U.S. history for that period of the campaign during the summer. And that had a huge impact in tearing down Romney and creating this caricature of who he was. It's true that finally, when Romney was able to appear on stage with Obama on the first debate, he was able to blow away that caricature and sort of get back to level. But if there had been more restrictions on the kind of spending that the Democrats could have done, they wouldn't have been able to do this negative barrage during the summer, and that might have changed it. And if you follow this inference, I'm not sure that they feel that they have such a strong motivation to change, right? It benefited them this time around. So while there's a lot of crocodile tears about it, this is a team that has mastered that part of it. Now, the one part of campaign finance that may get more scrutiny is donations from abroad. Republicans are very concerned about the mechanisms that the Obama campaign has set up to solicit donations, and there's questions about how much of that came in was not the legal money that the Supreme Court said is allowed to be spent, but was illegal money from foreigners interfering. Probably wasn't enough to tilt the election, but it might be enough to catch attention. So I'd expect that there will be some investigations of that aspect of campaign finance.
Yeah, go ahead, yeah. So the Kyoto Treaty has expired. The question in Copenhagen was a successor to it. And I do think one of the mistakes in the Kyoto Treaty was, that the developing countries had virtually zero responsibility. There's a principle that's gone into some other environmental policies, including the so-called Montreal Protocol that was for ozone protection against aerosols and stuff. It's called common but differentiated responsibility. And the idea is that there is a common responsibility for all countries to do something about these environmental hazards. And China and India and others didn't cause as much of the problem, but going forward. But the responsibility is differentiated, not just based on ability to pay, but kind of the historical record, right? So if we in the West have been causing it and a formula was worked out in the ozone treaty that actually countries agreed to. That treaty has had a pretty good impact, closing the hole in the ozone and everything. And it was in the Kyoto Treaty, but it never quite got fleshed out. And to the extent that developing countries say, we have zero responsibility, they're wrong. But I think you have to, that principle is the key to going forward. And I think that there needs to be, an international basis for that. Some of it can be done, frankly, if the United States and China had some understandings between us, we could get the ball rolling because we together account for an enormous amount, of the problems of climate change. Domestically, and I know there have been a lot of controversy about Solyndra, and there have been, some of these green companies going bankrupt, and the economic analysts say that there's too much expansion globally, at a time where subsidies were falling in places like Spain and Germany, and so they misread the market. But there's a lot of win-win there in terms of export industries. It's not going to totally replace what we've lost in the old-fashioned manufacturing. So I think domestically, one of the principles that we learn in international relations is the so-called principle of self-help. You do what for yourself when only you can do for yourself. And one of those, I think, is being more competitive, in some of these technologies, wind, solar, a variety of those. And even the Solyndra case, I think the portfolio of investments coming out of the stimulus plan, I think, had about a 5% failure rate. Bain Capital has a higher rate. I mean, people would say, but everybody talked about Solyndra, and in fact, there was a lot of success there. So it's both domestic and international.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that Solyndra had caught on in the public attention was because of the link to the donors. So it looked like cronyism, not just bad investments, but payola for campaign donations. I'm more skeptical about the politics, domestic and international, on climate change. So when I talked with the Obama people in the summer before they took office, so this is summer of '08, they had I think a plausible political strategy for how to advance on their agenda on climate change. And the key was to show up in Copenhagen in December of '09 with equipped with something, with some kind of meaningful legislation passed in Congress that would be sort of the down payment from the United States that could then encourage the Chinese and others to ante up, and they had a strong tailwind of support from the Europeans, who were even more forward-leaning on this than the Americans. And so that was the strategy, and it had a certain amount of political sense to it. And when they won supermajorities in the Senate and in the House in '09, I thought, okay, the domestic constellation has come together. They'll be able to show up in Copenhagen. Instead, they showed up at Copenhagen essentially empty-handed. And while there was a fig leaf of solution, of a press release at the end, I think it's fair to say Copenhagen fell far short of what their campaign for Copenhagen was. And what's happened in the last 3 years is a retreat globally in terms of public and governmental willingness to incur the short-term costs now to deal with a problem that's the most acutely felt several decades from now. A lot of these countries feel like they have an acute problem right now on jobs or whatever, and they can't afford the costly measures now that they believe would be necessary. So I think if President Obama had campaigned on that issue and came in with a strong mandate, then there might be a way of reigniting that. But I just don't see the political coalition, domestically or internationally, for significant progress. At least not unless the extreme weather things changes the public framing of this issue in ways that I can't anticipate in the next year. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think, or at least I hope, that one of the main takeaways for the Republican Party last night is that they have a mandate and a responsibility to help lead and govern, not just obstruct. Do you foresee a change in the way the president works with Congress, in particular with sequestration and the fiscal cliff coming up?
So the fiscal cliff is going to get immediate attention. It'll be for everybody's concerned, the economy, Wall Street, and it'll be an effort for the president to show that he can get things done. It's just two things on that. One, two of the leading scholars of Congress, Tom Mann and Norman Ornstein, who are both with think tanks in Washington, and they wrote this book a year or two ago. Said it's not just Congress, that it's the fundamental, we're going to disagree on this, it's the obstructionist Republicans, in Congress. When McConnell says my highest priority is to make sure, of course it's a priority, but that was going far. And the Republicans in the House were just, they were like Andre Gromyko during the Cold War, Mr. Niet, right, to everything. So I think that the president really has tried to work with them. I don't buy the criticism at all that he hasn't. But I think that, they kept sort of moving what the point of compromise was. I think one of the most important things going to be now is going to be to stop with the 60-vote cloture, the frequency of use in that in the Senate. And I think that sufficient Republicans have been frightened by these results that they may see that, doing what Mitch McConnell wants won't always be in their interest. I think the vastly underestimated Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, who actually gets much more done than he's often given credit for, and is really pretty well respected among his colleagues on the Democratic side.
Does he have a good staff?
He has a very good staff, yeah. I think that our son works for him, so that was probably his objective. That's right. So, but I think that you can't change the rules. It's hard to change the rules, but it would be a norm. And I think if you hold up one graph and you show the American people, historically how much this is used and how it's been used the last couple of years. So I think the goal is going to be to get things done, and the Republican Party is going to have to figure out, does it believe that that's in its own interest or not? And I think the president is in a very good position, not just to say my way or the highway, but I think in some ways he will be firm about, I'll compromise, but I'm tired of you guys, kind of moving the center point here. So.
Yeah, of course, I read the history a little differently, in part because I think Bob Woodward's reporting has exploded the myth that it was just Republican obstructionism. And of course, Obama's treatment of Simpson Bowles also explodes the myth that it was just Republican obstructionism. The other point I would make on this is that I think Obama can learn something from the Bush administration. I know that's heresy. But they did a pretty good job of replicating many of the policies of the Bush administration in the first term. But the one that they didn't do was the lesson that the Bush administration learned too late, but did learn by the second term, that they had to reach out to Democrats. The Bush administration did not do a good job. I mean, they did some with Teddy Kennedy and the education bill, and so there are a couple examples early on, but for the most part, in the first term, I think the Bush administration did not do a good job of reaching out to Democrats. I think they did a much better job in the second term of reaching out to Democrats. And they did that even though they believed that the 2004 election results had sort of vindicated their arguments on many terms. Now, they did it because they were in a real pickle in Iraq, and they needed to. But they also did it, I think, because of a change in mentality at the White House. And one of the things I'm most interested to see is whether the Obama White House in the second term adopts some of this outreach that was totally lacking in the first term for the Obama administration, pretty much lacking in Bush's first term, but showed up in the second term. And that will be an interesting test of your proposition.
So I think we run over time here. So anyway, thanks to the organizers, and you can go listen to the pundits tonight and see if we're right, wrong, different, or whatever. But anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.